And another piece of news that I found really interesting that I saw was the fact that there is going to be a Game of Thrones movie being made through Warner Brothers. Apparently, they're trying to develop a film based on the George R. Martin's fantasy universe.
Hmm.
And I'm gonna be very honest. I watched season one of House of Dragon simply because I recorded an episode with another friend of mine to talk about it. But I have not watched season two, mainly because I feel like ever since the end of Game of Thrones, I just haven't had the same love for it as I did before. Like I really did love the original series, but of course, as many people as many people feel, many people feel this way that like the last season was not that great. Everything that was
Hmm.
happening around the show and the development of the last season was not good. And although House of Dragon is a very solid show and a phenomenal series, I don't feel invested in the House of Dragon enough to care. So now that they're making this film, I also feel even less invested in this because it's just kind of like, do we need it? Did we ask for this? Did we want this? And the answer to all those questions is no. You
Yeah,
know?
I have not been a fan of the whole franchise since season 5 of Thrones, and it just got to that point where I was just like, I think they got spoiled in the success, and
Yeah.
I think everyone's blinded by nostalgia. Don't get me wrong, we all are in some capacity, but I'm seeing so many, like, I would rewatch certain seasons and be like, this is a filler episode, but I didn't see it at the time. Was so invested in the binge. And so I don't know. I think I'd be down to just see someone do their own medieval fantasy, if anything. Just let them open the floodgates and do their own thing instead of.
Right.
But I am getting annoyed at people anytime they see an epic on TV. They're like, it's the next Game of Thrones. I'm like, oh Lord, there's been so many epics. It didn't just
Yeah.
start with that.
That's true. I think it's because Game of Thrones is the one fantasy series that was very successful and widely popular.
Yeah, I guess so.
Now all of them kind of like are a default like, oh, this is like, if you like Game of Thrones, you'll like this show. And it's not like Game of Thrones, it's just also fantasy with kings and queens and orcs and elves, and it's like they think it's the same thing, but it's not really the same thing. And it doesn't help that like, I mean, I haven't rewatched Game of Thrones since like season 7 ended. And have I wanted to? I mean, sometimes for like nostalgia's sake, but sometimes it's kind of like you don't really need to. And I still like fantasy. I still give fantasy shows a try. I think that a fantasy film would be fun, and I would prefer an original idea over them making a Game of Thrones film or them rewriting Arthur, Alexander the Great, any of these other epics that are already well known and like
Right.
published and like in the literary world are like household names. And if you could do
Hmm.
something a little bit different, then that would be a lot more fun. But doing something that we've already done before is a little tired.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it's different from like Scary Movie because at least Scary Movie is funny and hilarious, and people there is like a genuine like desire for this film franchise to come back. And the Wayans brothers, they are a comedy powerhouse. So
Yes.
people will like back whatever they do. And then you have Game of Thrones where it's very clear they're trying to rectify season 7, and mostly everybody's just kind of like, let's just have House of Dragon and then leave it at that. You know what I mean? Like at that point, the prequel series can just kind of like do its own thing because it's not meant to last more than like 3 seasons, which has already been
Right.
stated by the show creator and by George R. Martin. So you can have that and leave it there. HBO or whatever studio, Warner Brothers, trying to make more money out of Game of Thrones when those two guys, the two I don't know, the two Dave guys, like, trying to that messed up season 7, like you trying to rectify their mistakes. Just leave it as it is. Just like let it be.
This is where it gets subjective. It's just like, yeah, you got to look at stuff where it's just like, okay, so how much of that is you trying to make the book fans happy versus this makes sense on its own merit? uh I've never been able to read any of those books. I have been able to read Lord of the Rings after much sitting down with a crowd. Dune, it's too deep for me, but I get why people like it. It's just It was before we had internet and we had more imagination. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's other fantasy books where I'm like, okay, well, I can see why someone would want to invest in that other than the fact that it's, a New York Times bestseller. It's got something that people cling on to and dig.
Yeah. I I think that in terms of fantasy, I don't know, because fantasy is kind of like a touchy genre to get
Mhm.
into, and I think shows like Delicious in Dungeon and The Legend of Vox Machina, those are two shows that are in the realm of fantasy, but they're both animation. And they're both fairly
Right.
popular and people like them. And I think that sometimes if you have a genre that isn't doing well with the live action, then animation is a better way to do that. And I feel like
Communicate it.
that there are ways to solve your problem besides going back to what worked before, because just because
Bingo.
it worked before doesn't mean it's gonna work again. And although it worked before, it didn't actually work out the way y'all wanted to, because nobody wants to talk about the last season of Game of Thrones, and everybody's dreading this movie because no one really has a lot of confidence in it. That's why they're quietly developing the movie. So
It's kind of almost become a point of contention for when you get into arguments like, whoa, 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 you're okay with this, but you're giving this other movie or show a hard time.
uh
It's
huh.
so funny how you do that. I would do this with everybody. I would call my mother out if she hated this one particular gangster movie. It's like, well, you technically like this. Oh, it was different. I'm like, no, no, it's as much of the same.
Yeah, it's
Same
pretty
thing with
similar.
same thing with cringe comedy. I've called my dad on that. And I'm like, okay, it's part of the same coin. I don't know, man. It's
Yeah.
making me uncomfortable. I'm like, well, that's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's true. That's true. But um,
yeah, fantasy, man. I I don't know where you really go because like I don't know how much of it is spending time on the effects versus production
mm,
versus suspension of disbelief.
yeah.
Making cause Netflix is doing a lot of fantasy shows, but I can never keep up with any of them because they don't promote them.
Now that I'm thinking about it, I think Delicious in Dungeon is the only fantasy show on Netflix that I can think of. But that's an anime that's on Netflix.
All
You know the
right, so there you go.
yeah.
Like it's easier to animate, even though it's expensive, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
easier to picture and instead
Yeah.
of worrying about a green screen and
Right.
having an actor spout mumbo jumbo that only makes sense when you actually watch the movie.
Right.
Uh,
That's true. That's true.
yeah.
But I guess we'll see what happens, and we'll see if this movie gets made, or if they're just gonna shelve this movie the same way they shelved the Game of Thrones.
Acme.
Yes,
Isn't that ridiculous how everyone's doing the whole it's a tax write off? I'm like, you're not gonna make anything.
right.
You're just gonna get yourself fired, which is probably good because you're doing bad decisions. But I'm like, good lord. I don't need well, riddle me this. Why do people do screen tests, like test screenings, and then don't even take those notes? It just seems
Well,
counter to me.
it's
Like,
only because like the people who actually make decisions on films don't actually care about filmmaking. They only want to make money.
right.
That's
But
the
like
problem.
but that's what I just find so funny too, is like they're looking for that consensus and at the same time, like even if people thought are impressed, they'll still be like, yeah, no, I don't want to do it anyway. I'm like, I thought
Yeah.
you said the key to whether you gave extra investment, but like they'll even release stuff that's like unfinished. I'm like, well, no
Mm-hmm.
wonder everyone hated it. It's unfinished.
Yeah. It's kind of like the buck stops with them, so they want to like wield their power however they want to.
Yes, that's what the HBO guy, Max guy, is doing. Is like he seems to just want to destroy every other thing and just like, okay, well, why?
Why? Why are you doing this to us, sir?
You just hate it here.
I think I remember reading an article where he used to work at GQ, and he had
Oh
like
no.
he apparently was not a great I guess CEO to that
So he's a
magazine as
magazine
well.
hack, and then he becomes a studio hack. And
Mhm.
then but like you're saying, is like they're not the filmmaker, but I do think there is a fine line. Like if you are a producer who's been a creative force, like again, Spielberg's going to look at stuff and be like, okay, like the most notes he's often given out to someone is change how that character dresses and don't kill that one character.
Mm-hmm.
Audiences will reject it. The rest is fine. And then you see other guys who are just angry, loud, and you're just like, how'd you get here? You're such a jerk to
Right.
everybody. I'm surprised no one's filed an HR complaint. It's just,
I'm sure
I
there are
don't know.
people who have, but those things kind of tend to get buried, and I'll,
That's unfortunately true too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, or they have connections, and they just talk to a
Yes.
guy, and then if they can't work at this place, they'll just go to another place. It'll be the same thing over again.
I hope they boycott the Rust guy from ever working in Hollywood, though.
The Rust guy,
The guy,
Alec
there was the
Baldwin.
yeah, there was the armorer guy.
Oh,
He had been like
oh,
all these other low budget productions, got complaints, and they still hired him anyway. And like, well, whoever was bidding him must have just not looked closely and just said, "Oh, hearsay." I'm like, it's not hearsay if a bunch of people are constantly complaining about this man.
yeah, that's not hearsay at all. That's a problem. That's an issue.
He will cost you your safety, and
Yes.
it got into
Especially
even so many other ridiculous, just political discussions. It's like, I don't care who shot the person; they didn't mean to kill anybody. But
hmm
if that person had checked the prop, it's just, uh, I don't know.
yeah.
I didn't mean to get too political, but it's just like,
No, it's fine. Unchecked power in Hollywood is very irritating, and it happens a lot. And I mean, it's a
mm-hmm,
big reason as to why like Warner Brothers is trying to like rectify the way that Game of Thrones is being viewed, because the creators of the show, after George R. Martin left, they decided to do their own thing, and of course they're the writers, they're the creators, and the actors are just kind of like having to deal with it because they work there. They just work there. And so when you don't have anybody who puts these people in check, they cost you money in the end of the day, but they still keep giving these people jobs because like they don't actually want to like hold anyone accountable because they're all buddies and they're all pals, and it's a boys club and blah blah blah, all that stuff. It's BS.
yeah. Oh, and I think that's the other thing is a lot of them are so spoiled they don't keep in touch with today's culture. Like they'll want to. It's like, oh, we want the Academy vote, or we want to play the race card, or we want to play the LGBTQ card, but they don't actually care in the actual message, you know? And it's like, well, forcing it in there is just a bit as big a disservice. Like you should actually care about the positive cause, if there is one, in a movie, and make sure it jibes, it's being told well, it's not whitewashed, it's not, half-assed. Just and you see it so often. It's like that actor's not that race that you're claiming them to be. It's like they're not that, or they can't do that. They're good for investment, but they can't do this kind of role. You need someone who's better at it, and it's greed. It's just plain simple greed.